My name is James Mussell. I'm an Associate Professor at Victorian Literature, University of Leeds.
And I'm Laurel, and I'm an Emeritus Professor of Print Culture at Birkbeck.
We've been invited to talk today a little bit about digitisation and digital periodicals. And what we'd like to do is think a little bit about the digitisation of historical periodicals that are in the archive and have been put online in various resources, but also think about the way we use digital periodicals today to support our scholarship and to reach audiences, both online and offline.
Yeah, and to think about also the history, but also the future of 19, where we were very both involved in the beginnings of the Journal, and it was at the time it would seem to be quite a innovative thing to do, and there weren't many good examples. So, we are so delighted to see what's happened in the last decade.
Yeah. So maybe a good place to start would be to think about we'll start with talking about digitising historical periodicals, and then we'll move on to 19 a bit further on.
Yeah.
So maybe we can start by thinking about some of the challenges that are involved in digitising periodicals in the archive. Well, what are your thoughts about periodicals in the archive?
Well, we need to think about how mixed the archive is itself, how imperfect bound issues of single copies of 19th century journals are. So the task of then remediating them and in putting them in digital form is twofold. It's obviously changing from one medium to another, but it's also the problem of how complete, incomplete the archive is. And I don't mean only missing journals, missing issues, but I mean the fact that most of the advertising has been stripped out. And also, for example, the sometimes the prelims. So recently I saw a periodical that had failed, and we couldn't find any evidence that it was going to do that. And yet when I looked in the press, they all talked about the obituary of the periodical that was included in it. And the reason we didn't see that was because in the archive there was no prelim. Right. So this is lost unless there is another copy of the archive, in the archive somewhere else. So we need that. One of the things about the historic document is that digitizing historic periodicals means that only one copy is digitized and made available, and that copy is bound to be, a form of that historic object. So, we always need to work between print and digital, and we need to, if possible, work between different copies of prints. They're not all, quote, the same.
It's one of the things that happens, isn't it? That when we, in a kind of digital world, we privilege the archival copies, and we think about them in a kind of rarefied, pure form. But our experience of working in the archive is that it's messy and complicated, and often the most valuable information is the most ephemeral, and it only exists maybe in one run and not another run. Yeah. I guess for me, one of the real challenges of digitising these things, there's two. One is that you have to know what it is you're digitising, which means you have to ask questions of this material in the archive and have an idea of what that object is. What is the periodical? What is the issue? What is the volume? What is the run? And then what do you include and what don't you include? What aspects of it are worth recording and what gets left behind? And that's really difficult intellectual work.
It was. It is.
We did a project together a few years ago called the 19th-Century Serials Edition. I think one of the things we learnt while doing that project was how little we actually knew about these periodicals, these newspapers, the raw material of our careers, right? And we learned a lot just through the process of having to ask these really fundamental questions. What is this stuff? What needs to be saved? What can get left out? How do you remediate?
And of course, almost all digital copies are taken from volume forms of journals, not issues. And I was looking at a magazine called Universal Review the other day, and I saw it in Senate House Library and it had no covers, and then I saw it in the British Library and the covers were bright red, and it made the whole difference. Right now they didn't have all the covers. They had 2 bound in at the end of the volume. Now, does the digital project copy the Senate House copy, if that's what the access is? And never know about the British Library copy. And of course there's no bibliographical record of which copies have covers, or which have or don't have prelims. I don't think we'll ever find the missing prelims to that periodical that failed, for example. Never. I just don't believe it. But and we know nothing bibliographically about where single issues lie in the archive.
Yeah.
So, ideally, the digital edition of the historic archive would include multiple copies. It would not only seek to fill in, quote, the issue that's missing, but it would try to recover, illustrations and so on. It's not only filling in individual issues, it's a matter of trying to see what the penumbra of any single issue is, and I mean, if it were really as opposed to commercial copies of historic periodicals, if it were really an ideal copy, then we would have a large amount of multiple manifestations.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because that's sort of the second important question I think that digitalisation raises, is that we don't have a sense of what the archive is as a whole. We have, in terms of finding print copies of periodicals, we have various finding resources. We have the Waterloo Directory, which is our biggest list of periodicals. We have the Wellesley Index, which is probably our most detailed account of who contributed to the periodicals. We have the British Union Finding List, which is an old document now which lists extant runs of periodicals. But we don't have a good idea of what's in all of the different archives that are out there. In many ways, it's easy to think of the archive as the pure source, but it's also a bit of a mystery. We don't know quite what's in it or what's waiting to be found.
I mean, there is something called the newspaper press directories, and they are annual volumes, that list whatever appears in the media in any single year. And of course, they do provide us with a snapshot annually, for 100, for 40, 75 years for the period. But it's true, we don't know what's in the archive. And the only portion of the archive that is digitized of the 19th century historic periodicals is less than 1%. So we're talking about, say there's 50,000 individual titles, separate titles, which has been calculated by John North from Waterloo. We have less than 1% of that, 400. 400 titles, something like that, have been digitized. So there is this huge proportion of the historic archive that is not available. It's only geographically, specifically available where it's held.
And that print archive itself is incomplete.
Isn't
it? As you're saying, Laurel, these issues exist in multiple formats. They've been captured at particular points in their lives. They've been transformed when they've been made part of a broader collection. So a lot of the time when we talk about periodical studies, we're talking about studying things that no longer exist or we can only posit. And people often, they write articles, talk about a particular issue of a journal. But what people usually mean is the issue of that journal is bound in one particular volume, somewhere in a very specific archive. But a lot of that bibliographical information is cut off in a kind of shorthand. We pretend we're dealing with the press as it was, but we're really dealing with the press as it is now, today.
The remains.
The remains.
The remains.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Maybe we could say a bit about some of the physical constraints that make digitizing these things difficult. So we talked about the archive's big, first of all, isn't it? It's huge.
Huge.
Yeah, so there are
unfathomable.
Right, right.
We don't know what the archive is. Yes.
So there's a lot out there to be digitized, and so people who come with these projects have to decide which specific titles to include and which to leave out. The other issue, I guess, is that the runs are often fragmented. There's portions of runs in various places, and we found on NCSE that we had to piece together some of our periodicals. The Tomahawk, I think, was one that we sourced from, and we used hard copy for some issues and then microfilm copies of other issues because we couldn't find the hard copy that microfilm was filmed from. So there's a kind of reconstruction that goes on too.
Oh, yeah. And the digital format is the latest reconstruction, right? It's comparable to the volumes that the libraries and the publishers published.
I'm very, sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
And I'm very keen to move away from the idea that the archive is a fixed and bounded entity, a pure source for historical research. It's an interpretation in its own right. And then every time people return to the archive and do things in it, every return leads to new ideas and new ways of conceiving the past. And in some ways, digitization seems like it's a new step or a remediation of archival materials, but archives themselves remediate their contents all the time.
All the time. And, I mean, we see that, for example, in the way in which 19th-century periodicals often escape from the date stamp by producing pamphlets from their material. Or they produce illustrations that they then reproduce for independent circulation, right? Or they decide that they will take a particular section and reproduce it as a guide to the Great Exhibition. Or, so there are really very canny, and persistent strategies of the publishers to recirculate the material at the time, and in the next 6 months they produce volumes, and then in a year they produce volumes, and they want those volumes to go into libraries. And when they produce them in the volumes, they strip the adverts out. So, the idea that periodicals are ephemeral is not altogether reliable, I would say. The publishers have a lot of strategies about how to reproduce them, not least in volume library editions.
Yeah. So there's different periodicals have different relationships with time and being memorialized in that way. And different parts of the same periodical also have a different relationship with being memorialized. So the contents, the inside, designed to be kept maybe, whereas the wrappers are designed to be stripped away. And then different types of content are packaged to circulate in different networks, circulate over different portions of space. Some parts of periodicals are designed to be reprinted and copied elsewhere. The contents in the object isn't bounded by that object. It's often, in many cases, designed to go beyond.
Fall apart.
Right.
Yes. I mean, the centre holds because, regularly there is an issue, monthly or weekly or daily, of the journal, right? Which readers come to rely on in terms of a rhythm. But the fact is, it splits apart in all kinds of ways, and it's perpetuated. And it disappears.
And even that rhythm's complicated, isn't it? So we know about the multiple editions in one of our titles, The Northern Star. We found that there were at least 3, sometimes 4 editions every day. But in the British Library holdings, we found 8 copies that were kept. And we never quite could work out whether those were 8 separate editions or 4 separate editions plus a few spare copies. Nonetheless, the library decided to keep them all. So we thought we should digitise them all when we came to it, because if only to remember that act of previous remembering by the library, who obviously thought it was important to keep these 8 distinct copies. But we had conversations at the time where people said, well, why do you want 8 copies of the same thing if only 1 or 2 articles are slightly different? But to us, those were the telling differences.
Well, some of these were meant to. The publication came from Leeds, but it was circulated in London and Ireland, if you recall, and then there was a Welsh edition. So it was very interesting, and however imperfect and uneven that archive is, we want to show the raggedness of it, of what survives, for sure. I mean, I agree with you that the date stamp is, and the regularity are. It seems to me not any longer a fantasy we shouldn't be entertaining. I think that's right. I think that's right. So, I mean, the question about the digitization, however, does not meet the problem we had of geographically specific located archives, because we now have this small number of digitized texts, which of course is almost more than we can bear and work with in so many to have them accessible in that way, except they're only partially accessible. They're behind paywalls, and that's a real problem. And some of these are so successfully behind expensive paywalls that they are hardly seen at all.
And in many ways, the paywall, the conditions of access to periodicals work against one of the great benefits of digitization, is that it sets this content free from the structures of the archives that the periodicals are contained within.
That is such a sadness, really. I think that's right. And the other interesting difference in distribution between print periodicals and digitized ones is that mostly these periodicals on digital platforms are only available through institutional access. In other words, these publishers do not sell to individuals. And that's quite an issue. That's quite an issue, it seems to me. We're getting, I mean, some of them are beginning to sell to individuals, but it's quite rare still, it seems to me. And the publishers refuse to deal with the individual reader.
So you're saying that paywalls are a barrier to access, but they're also one of the ways in which these resources can finance themselves. Because as we found out from NCSE, digitization doesn't come cheap. There's a cost, and the cost is both for the work of the actual digitization, the scanning, it's all the processing, and also the editorial work as well. It is quite labour intensive. I wonder if we could spend a minute thinking about the different types of digital resource that are available to us and how they differ. Because you mentioned that some were sold to libraries on a subscription model, and then some were sold for individual users to use. So the British Newspaper Archive, for instance, would be a good example of the latter, which works on sole subscribers. But do you think, do those funding mechanisms affect the way they present the periodicals?
Oh yes, I think they do. I'm not sure if it's. I mean, it's a very interesting history about how these two, these two models originate. It seems to me that British Newspaper Archives came from the British Library, and very soon after the British Library began to digitize its collections, they clearly decided they couldn't do it themselves. And so they began to work with corporate groups, didn't they? And the people who produced the British Newspaper Archive are now the British Library's chosen party. And so their interest publishing-wise is ancestry. So clearly their choice of what to digitize has to do with the wealth of information possible for people who are interested in families and genealogy. And so, lots of titles that scholars might wish to produce through digitization, do not fall within their preferred remit. Whereas some of the other publishers, the bigger publishers like Gale and Cengage, who they have extant microfilm, right? And that certainly, and 19th-century stuff was out of copyright, and so they used extant microfilm, and of course those microfilms were filmed many decades ago. So the choice of text wasn't anything to do with best practice. Whereas I think the Times Digital Archive, which is one of the first projects of digitization of historic periodicals, they were working from sheets, weren't they? And they were trying to do the best possible at the time they did it.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So then there's different criteria for selection, what gets included and what doesn't get included. And then there have to be some criteria of selection, especially given what we're saying about the archive, the abundance of stuff there is yet to digitise, and the way that academic fashions change as well. And there were some no-brainers, right? If you're going to digitise any newspaper, the Times is a good one to start with. But when it comes to periodical press, you could kind of follow the Wellesley maybe and get those Wellesley titles involved. But as we know, there's all sorts of assumptions about what are the most important titles in the period. But it's interesting to think about how the intended users of these archives shapes what gets included in them, but also how they're presented within the archive. So the British Newspaper Archive has quite a nice browsing mechanism. You can scroll through, it presents individual issues as individual issues, and then you can zoom in and out of the pages. Whereas the ProQuest and the Gale resources are a bit more database-like. And so it's more like, they resemble a library catalogue with a simple search and an advanced search. It asks a lot more, I think, of its users, actually, that kind of resource.
Oh yeah, it does. And it's very vexing about the way in which it presents issues, right? Individual issues. it does a hilarious thing, which is, or sometimes a volume. They organize the contents alphabetically. So I mean, it doesn't reproduce the issue, in the sense that you wouldn't see the first article first or the prelims first, for that matter. You might see them, 12 items down, depending on their alphabetical title place. So to reconstruct, if that's what you want to do, you may not want to do that. But if you want to read an issue as a text, for example, it's difficult to do in some of the historically produced archives like we had first from British periodicals.
It is, isn't it? And I think that shows that perhaps we're in the minority in terms of what we want to do with these periodicals. I think what most users want is just to find articles about stuff. They're interested in a topic, they want to throw in some keywords, and then get articles that are relevant, that apply to those keywords. Whereas you and I are interested in the objects themselves that are kind of beneath this process. But the only way to square those two things, it seems to me, is to understand the process of digitization, to understand the stages that this material has gone through, and all those choices that have been made about how to digitize it, how to structure it, who the people that have done that think are going to use it. You need to have that history, that bibliographical history of the digital resource, to kind of recover the absent print object that it's been based upon.
And, it seems to me that one of the things that we see with those alphabetical lists is a disconnect between the scholar, because of course at that time when they first did British periodicals, their target audience was us. It was academics, for sure. And if anybody had ever asked us, we would have said to them, don't do it that way. Don't do it that way. That doesn't make much sense. But the other thing that's happened, the 19th century press was one of the earliest available out of copyright materials, and so 10 years ago these publishers were very interested in us and they came to all our conferences and so on. But one of the things that's happened in the course of this is that periodical studies or media history has come into its own. So there are more of us now. There are more of us. However, although there are more of us, there are many more of people who want items, individual items, and they're searching for results. One of the things the archive should do, it seems to me, the digital archive, is to offer them the material in such an interface and in such a way that they are conscious of where it's coming from, what that means, what its position is in the paper, if necessary, if possible, a title page and a cover. It would be wonderful to have a cover. It would be wonderful to have them in paper, in color. Yeah, right. I mean, the digital archive, of course, was in black and white. Yeah. And that's all changed.
Well, that's often to do with microfilm in between.
It has to do with microfilm. Yeah. So that's certainly one of the things that, so fresh filming, fresh filming is a real desideratum, it seems to me, if it means that, we can in some way make the digital object, attractive, and so that it is a facsimile in some sense, and that it trails its history, it's visible history, and it should encourage people to look into the trail of iterations, of which the digital is one.
Yeah. I still see a tension between two different models, a kind of archive model which goes, we've got all this content, what we're going to do is turn it into a searchable database of articles about stuff, and then an edition model which is trying to model a print object in a new medium, in a digital medium. And I think the best resources can combine a bit of both, because there are times as a scholar that you do want articles about something.
Oh yeah,
and you need a way to recover them. And let's not forget that search is one of the big benefits of digitization. If you go to any conferences, there's always endless discussions about the limits of OCR, optical character recognition. But just having rough and ready textual transcripts which are searchable turns the press inside out, and it opens it up in a way which we've never been able to experience before. And it's important, I think, not to forget or take those sorts of steps for granted. I think there's other things we might do with that processable data. So the archive model is important, but I think you need an element of that addition model as well. An opportunity to see the page as a whole, or to recognise that these are issues, that these pages belong in a set. And yeah, to see things like layout and typography. I'm often really keen on saying that we've never been so able to see what the Victorian press has looked like as we are today.
Absolutely.
And we can see more of it today probably than people could in the Victorian period, because we can conjure it up with just a few clicks on a keyboard or on a mouse or whatever. It's worth saying too, there are other ways of getting 19th century periodicals in digital form. And we've worked with publishers over the years who have been publishing these things and then sort of selling them back to us. But because the 19th century press is out of copyright and there's so much of it in prestigious libraries around the world, it's been taken up as part of Google Books or as part of the Internet Archive.
Or making American.
Or making American,
yeah. Right.
So there are lots of other ways in which you can recover 19th century print in digital form outside of some of those more structured archives. I think those other resources demand different skills of users too. I mean, if you've ever tried to use the Internet Archive and get hold of periodicals, it's difficult because it's designed for books, not periodicals. And so if you search for a periodical, you get numerous hits because it's all the different volumes. And often the metadata is not good enough to tease out which one you want. But nonetheless, it's there, and it's a great resource that could be used.
It's kind of there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we clearly need to do when we teach is provide the kind of immense literacy skills of how students and researchers can access this very, you know what, there is no single finding list of which 19th century historic periodicals are digitized or where. I mean, so you have to search all over the place, right? You search maybe one of, 9 or 10 possibilities. And you're right, if you get to Internet Archive, it may be there, but you may not be able to find it, and sometimes you're really lucky because someone's been interested in it at some library, and so they do it, and there it is. But in very variable format and element. You don't know what iteration you're looking at, and there's lots of problems. But I do think that, of course, that this notion of digitizing the archive is never going to, there's no way that it's going to be any responsible portion of the archive. There's always going to be a huge, majority of the 19th century archive. I mean, libraries will run out of interest, energy, and so on, and of course the ones that are digitized are the ones that people work on. It's as though our students think there isn't anything else. It's very awkward when we say to them, well, you really need to go to the library.
I think that's a really important point. There was a moment where, as you're saying, Laurel, large chunks of the Victorian press were digitised as part of resources. So ProQuest British Periodicals, Gale's UK 19th century periodicals, the Gale newspaper project, ProQuest historical newspapers, and then the British Newspaper Archive, which is ongoing with the British Library. And then it seems like publishers now are settling on individual titles. So Gale have done Punch edition, they've done Daily Mail Historical Archive, the Illustrated London News Archive.
The ILN's been done.
But it seems like it feels those broader sections of the press have been those have been done now. But because there is digitisation still going on in the Internet Archive, there still are additions to the digital things that are available.
There are.
But it's interesting that we still need to exert some bibliographical control over those and try and kind of make those lists and point people towards them. But it's also worth remembering that just because something's been digitised, it doesn't mean as an object that it's finished. It's possible to revisit these things and do different things for them. For instance, the Internet Archive is freely available to users around the world, and it means, and you can download PDFs at the moment, or you can download plain text. It does mean that this can be tidied up and cleaned, that this material can be worked on further. I don't think even though the publishers might have done a product at one point and are maybe revising it and updating it, it doesn't mean that the rest of the community can't take on periodicals, tidy things up, initiate projects of their own. If
the publishers are willing to allow them. I mean, if it's on the Internet Archive, that material is accessible. But there is a real problem, isn't there, with some of the publishers. They do not want, they specifically, outlaw anything being done further with their fixed item.
And you can understand that, can't you? Because they've got a commercial interest in this stuff.
But you know what? It's the worst of print. in my view. There it is in digital format. It is the worst of print. Well, it's fixed, right? It's fixed.
Sure. Sure.
It's and that is, maybe we move then from these historic newspapers, which one of the great things before we do that is to say that one of the things that digitization of historic papers has provided us with is a consciousness of print culture. And when I took my my title, when I got my professorship, 15 years ago, whenever it was, I used that phrase, print culture. It was so rare, but it was really because digitization was teaching us to look at print. Of course, people who dealt with early printed books, looked at print, but they were bibliographers of a fairly arcane group and small and select and so on. But now we all look at print and the qualities of print.
Certainly, and what people call the new history of the book has been a real resurgence of interest in material culture, historical artifacts, has largely been driven by digitization. It's like we've only become aware of those properties of archival objects that are important when they're no longer there. Touch, smell, all those things, all those kinds of
thing
aspects.
Theory is born after we have become enamored of material culture.
And it's important to remember that digital resources themselves are material objects and have their own properties. I mean, we're not moving from a material past into a kind of intangible present, intangible future. These are objects in their own right. So when you were saying about literacy earlier on, I think that's one of the crucial things we need to teach people is that the digital is also an object. It's a material
object, right? Yeah. And when we did, really all you have to do is try and remediate the printed page to the digital object, and you realize just what the rules of the codex are, and the rules of print, and the rules of of digitization. We really came over. The resistance to those models is immense. It is a different medium. It is a different medium, and one with very much its own rules. Some of which have to be discovered.
I think that's right. I think digital objects can be as truculent as material things can be, can't they?
For sure.
And we all know when digital objects misbehave. They're quite capable of doing that. I wanted to go back to a point Laurel said about how digitization has made print culture more visible. And one of the arguments that you've been making for a long time is that periodicals and newspapers are some of the central documents of Victorian culture. Do you think people are more aware of periodicals now they've been digitised? Do you think there's more of an awareness in Victorian studies?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I think, with the birth of Victorian studies as an area interdisciplinary group, came a birth of a very tiny Victorian periodicals group, and they grew up simultaneously. But with that outburst, if you like, proliferation of digitized titles, and the access, through the medium, right? Through the internet, I think periodicals have really come into view, if you like, of students and researchers, and I think that's right. We went to a conference in Oxford on medical periodicals, and it was interesting about the range of knowledgeability about the press. Some people were interested in medicine, but there were a lot of people there who were talking about the press.
Definitely.
Maybe we should try and shift and talk about born digital.
Before we do that,
yes,
could I make one point?
Yes.
Which is, I think you're right that periodicals have become more visible, but maybe the periodical resources themselves still seem strangely invisible. So that it's been my experience, you can read an article and they'll reach for an example from the press, and it'll be to some maybe provincial newspaper. But and we know the reason for that is because it's been digitised,
right? Yes,
and that's why it's there.
We do.
But the resource is seldom mentioned. It's as if that person is still consulting print. And the MLA guidelines usefully ask for you to name the medium in which your source has been found. But I think digital resources, which are so central to our scholarship, are still somehow invisible. And given the work that goes into making those resources by scholars, by publishers, I think citation is really, really important.
I think that's right. And if you look, I've been editing a book recently on the news of the world, and if you look at the citations, you know that many of them are digital, partly because there's no page numbers. Right? And so when I say to them, okay, I want an access, I want a URL and an access, they haven't kept a record. They haven't kept a record. It's so interesting how people obscure, you know, and so digital resources and text and objects are not quite as acceptable even in the scholar's mind, right? Even though they're so reliant on it. So not only do they not maybe acknowledge the provincial newspaper, but they don't tell us that they saw this, of course.
Sure.
Online.
Yeah, it's that broader bibliographical awareness that this content's coming from a particular newspaper, a particular moment, and it's been digitised at another moment for another set of purposes. And I think if we're going to take born digital scholarship seriously, a lot of those anxieties about digital scholarship come from a kind of hang-up or a kind of preconception that the digital is somehow insubstantial, is ephemeral, is not as real as print is. But really, it's our own scholarly practices that need to catch up. And just to kind of eradicate some of those outmoded ways of thinking. Given that the future of scholarship, both the Victorian periodicals, I think, and of scholarship more broadly, is digital. It's our main mode of reading and writing now. So we have to take it seriously. We have to take what we've learnt from print and apply it to the digital without getting kind of hung up with some of the assumptions that are born from being rooted in a print culture. A print culture which is now of the past or lives alongside a digital culture, a dominant digital culture.
I'll tell you something. I was with a colleague in the British Library who had been employed there, and we were walking out, and he turned around and he looked at the British Library, and he said, "In 25 years, it will be the Museum of Print." Wow. Now, I don't think that we will, in the next 2 centuries, eradicate print. We will have an archive of print.
Sure.
I think that, it may be that scholars do continue, very odd few people, do continue to use print resources. But I do agree with you that material that is not available digitally will fall off the radar. And that is one of the great it seems areas of conscience of historians, and of people in the academy who talk to students about past forms of discourse.
I think your librarian is wrong.
I do too. I think he's wrong too.
But the point is true, isn't it? That it's a digital culture in which print will play a part. But the way we understand print is in relationship to the digital. And will continue to be so. So maybe print does seem more real and solid because we have the digital, but we need to, like I said, take what we've learned about print and apply those same scholarly skills to digital resources too.
I think it's partly wrong because the British Library has totally changed. Yeah, and they are alive to this danger. They were alive to the danger, and they have changed. And they are carving out, as we all are changing.
Yeah.
As 19 is changing, right? Yeah. I mean, we have to look at the present and what the main medium of communication is and think about what the future formats of our reading will be.
One of the radical things I think about 19 when it started back in 2005 was that there was never a suggestion that it would be a print journal as well as a digital journal.
No.
And that was partly to do with resources. We knew full well that print was expensive and the digital seemed to be a cheaper option, although there's things to say about that too. But it was a kind of confident statement that the future of scholarship, of 19th century scholarship, was digital. And that this was a new medium in which it was possible to do different kinds of things. What were your memories of those early days, Laurel?
Oh, right. Well. I mean, I was very excited. We didn't know how to scope this and what kind of mock-up skills we need to develop and how we were going to distribute this and bring it to people's attention. But we were, very excited about the possibilities of making the journal look very appealing, and it was a sumptuous journal. All those color pictures, right? Color images, the graphics of the title, and so it was an exciting screen you looked at, for sure.
I'm hoping the anniversary celebrations of 19, we might see some of those earlier issues and some screenshots of its iterations over the decade.
That would be wonderful.
So that's quite a nice archive of how the history of the web's changed over the last 10 years too.
If we still have.
Yeah, I'm sure they're recoverable.
Yeah. Right. We tried to look at them, didn't we? We tried to look at them today. And I think that you've said that they are all been now brought into uniformity with the ubiquity.
It's one of those differences, isn't it, between so a run of a print newspaper. If you look at older issues, you see how it used to look. Whereas if you look at older issues of a digital journal, you'll see those old issues within the new current present frame. There's a kind of presentism about serial publishing in digital form, which there isn't quite, or a different relationship maybe with the past than there is in a print volume.
So it's collapsed, really.
Yes, but nonetheless, there are web archiving tools, and of course I think there's a case then for a journal to do its own archiving and to reflect, as periodicals used to in the 19th century, in the the end of year prefaces and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Just reflect on where it is and what it stands for, how it's changing, and the reasons why. Because as we said, those are the really interesting things for people in the future. Why decisions are made in those contingent moments, the things that tend to get stripped out and left. The scholarship likes to think it's talking for all time, but of course it always addresses a present.
I mean, all you need to do is look at the titles of 19th century journals, and you see a history of infinite merger, right? Infinite title change. It's remarkable.
Sure.
So when John North talks about 50,000 titles, that's because there are 150,000 titles, and he's traced them back to, genealogical families, as it were. They're changing over the years, but that's because they take in each other, they destroy each other, and so on. So, I mean, I think that the situation with the archive of the digital is really an interesting one. But to go back to 19 at its start, it seemed to me a very enlightened thing to try and build it into teaching and the graduate program.
Yeah.
And that was such a distinctive thing, so that as we learned, as we designed it, with the help of, people who had digital skills and who could do digital design, so our students. Yeah. So the intern project and the way in which, the students were involved with not only editing, but formatting and marking up and dealing with the incorporation of, illustration and dealing with contributors and all those things. That was really an exciting thing for people who were interested in the, not only interested in the project of the magazine, right? In a new format. Yeah. The project of the magazine. And so it was a real community thing. We met, and we met a lot to talk about what we might be doing and so on. And it seems to me the commitment to free access was really liberating. That was another important thing.
Yeah, we were very conscious at the time that open access was vital, and we talked about the problems of paywalls and institutions with historical resources. And it always seemed that scholarship that's being produced and given away by scholars who operate in an economy of esteem rather than getting paid. We don't get paid that much for what we write, if at all. It made sense to sort of circulate it as widely as possible, and an online platform allows you to do that at very little cost. It's a really easy way of taking advantage of digital properties, the ability to be reproduced and to be distributed very, very cheaply. Yes. But to go back to the interns, I think that was one of 19's real contributions, in that it provided a mechanism for teaching those digital literacy skills, the kinds of skills that are needed to recognise what digital objects are as objects, as well as kind of practical editorial skills as well.
Yeah. The other thing was the decision about interdisciplinarity.
Yeah.
We had a Victorian Studies MA here, and it involved the art department and the history department and, English. I mean, they were separate departments quite that way then. And the arts faculty wasn't as coherent, as it is now. And so this enabled this interdisciplinary. That was, so it was, it was a kind of digital rethinking of the project that started Victorian Studies, which was Victorian Studies as a journal, a paper journal, in the United States, quarterly, etc. So this was a wonderful kind of register of where not only the journal was coming from, which was these departments who were contributing to an MA in Victorian Studies, but also the way Victorian work on the 19th century looked to us. You know, and it was also the very interesting translation of Victorian to 19th century. That, you know, the 19, right? That also reflected the desire for the consideration of periodization. And we're talking about, you know, the long 19th century, how Victorian had limitations that we were thinking about, you know, and going outside up and so on. So, you know, it was it does reflect a moment.
Yeah. It also reflects
its place.
A place
and
as well,
its
doesn't
place.
it? Yeah,
Absolutely,
yeah.
it reflects its place.
And 19's kept that relationship with the centre, obviously, which publishes it and whose interns work on the journal, and also the way it draws on recent events at the 19th century studies for its content too.
Right.
And so it has an interesting relationship with Birkbeck, with
Yep.
London,
Yep.
and with the kind of unfolding series of events which are rooted in space and time. And the journal, in a way, kind of comes out of those moments. Usually within a year or so, there'll be an issue of 19 that draw. I don't want to pin anyone down to any deadlines, but it'll pin down to it'll kind of capture that moment, which otherwise would be ephemeral. It would pass, wouldn't
Yes.
it, away, and memorialises it in a series of journal articles.
It does.
Remediates that event and turns it into something which exists in a much more recognisable scholarly form.
It's true, and you know, one of the things that we were thinking about in terms of the way 19 appears is that its interface is that of course it appears as a series of items, right? So readers, it does still appear as issues, twice a year issues, but readers could read, and often do read, as we often read print, right, as individual things that interest us and to which we can go back. But there is a shape of an issue, and the theme issues make the issue more than the sum of its parts, right? I mean, it is, it does invite for you, the reader, the user, to look at an article and you think, oh yeah, well, look at the one that's following it. Of course, that's what we want readers. That would be my design on readers who would read in some ways alive to the shape of an issue. And of course, digital publication does undermine that, to say the least.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? Because a lot of scholarly journals which have now electronic versions, they publish in issues, but there's no reason to do that.
That's right.
It's like that's a kind of hang-up from print culture, where you'd gather your content, you'd publish it at once. And often online platforms I'm publishing in Notes and Records of the Royal Society at the moment, and my article's going online in 2 weeks, but I don't think the issue's out until November.
So there's pre-publication.
Yeah, and it's so the digital publishing is kind of geared up to publish content as and when it's ready. And in some disciplines, such as the sciences, that timeliness is vital.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Whereas in terms of art and lots of humanities scholarship, it's like we're still kind of imposing print deadlines onto digital content, structuring our digital journals as if they're still in print. And it's a kind of hang-up, I think, from print culture, which is unnecessary, a kind of nostalgia maybe for a certain way of doing things. I think it has a kind of capital. It gives credibility to the issues. That it looks like it was a print journal, and so we go, okay, we know what that is. But it seems a bit redundant.
It does. I mean, and when you think that, 19 was born digital, right? But it has all these redolent notions of print, right? I mean, like it's trailing print, behind it, right? And so now, I think that the plans for... So, as I said, I thought that the introduction of images and colour, which of course very few journals were able to muster in print.
Something so simple like colour reproductions.
It was absolutely. Yeah. We saw it on the Blake Archive and McGann's work. We saw it on McGann's work, but really, 19 was glorious. It was glorious, and of course the fact that it could be searched. That was remarkably good, and it was delivered to our screens. And that was wonderful. And as you say, it captured events and it spun events too. You know, there would be we planned an issue, but there was also a conference or a workshop, or you know, what isn't there now, it seems to me, is any interactivity, which of course digital resources do invite. I mean, and so I mean, let's just think about, so this issue that we're doing this for has all kinds of openings, as it were, of this rather traditional print format. Yeah, you know, that is the scholarly article that is peer-reviewed, and a succession of them in an issue. Full stop.
Yeah, not least
searchable.
Searchable. Not least that we're doing film.
Yes. Well, no. So the new one, you know, this one has podcasts. You know, it has video. It has illustrations. It'll have articles. It is really beginning. It seems to me. What it doesn't have is links. I mean, you and I talked about this, that when you look at 19 on screen, it is, dare I say it, a dull text.
I don't think that's a 19 thing. I think it's part of the way in which
scholarly,
the legacy of print has been imagined. Yeah, and it's striking, isn't it, that we've had the web now for almost 20 years, and scholarly journals, scholarly publishing is still basically PDFs, which is model paper. And there's been little embrace of things like the link, the fundamental building block of the web, instead relying on scholarly citations and references.
Yep.
Which is sensible. I don't think it's neither or.
No. But it would be interesting to have links, right, in the text. I mean, so that's kind of orderly, and you know, it does open the article to other places. Now, I know that there is a problem about link rot. Yes, I've heard about link rot. You know, and it may be, but you know what? That's no different than going to the library because you're following a reference, as I recently did, and find that the reference is bloody wrong. You know, that there is no issue. There is no article in the 1860 Quarterly Review on the press directories. I'm afraid there isn't. You know, but also if you go to books and they're not there anymore, right? They've been stolen, or they're too old, or they're just not there. So I don't think link rot online is any more or less frustrating than, you know, the kind of thing you do in the normal course of trying to get hold of a reference in a library. And if you're really lucky, it might be digitally available. You know, the reference, I mean. But you know, what I'm saying is that I think that that interactivity in the text of 19 and the possibility that future issues would include similar videos and you know, and podcasts and activities, and that maybe, I mean, I don't know what you think, but maybe that there should be some blog space, you know, so that there is some. I mean, I think scholarly journals are pretty bad, normally print ones, about letters and, you know, commentary, and print is really, or at least academic print, it's really fixed, isn't it?
Oh, we found that. Well, the genres of scholarly publishing have shown themselves to be been tenacious. They own their go, and they don't change.
And they don't let anybody in.
Even the material media that produced, and the forms of production that produced those genres now are substantially different. We still cling to those older genres, and there certainly is scope, isn't there, for exploring how digital scholarly publishing might develop, and to try and push against the kind of resistance of the scholarly article. I mean, it still plays a part. I think, you know, we have with the RAF and all those ways in which our scholarship is measured, we still probably need a place which looks traditional or authoritative. But nonetheless, there's plenty of opportunity to do different types of scholarly publishing, to do different things with the technology, and to publish in different kinds of modes as well.
I think peer review, that phrase, which is a guarantee of quality, is the tip of an iceberg of the unwillingness of scholarship on the whole to move, right? I mean, it's a way of keeping people out. It refers to the whole edifice, you know, of selection and you know, fenestration, really, of what we do. You know, and I think that it would be helpful if there was a porousness, which we could control, you know, but links might be one way. A blog, you know, blogs where people could respond to material and, you know, raise questions.
I'm very interested in a journal we've both been connected with, the Journal of Victorian Culture, which has got a separate online blog which sits alongside the journal space. And in that case, they're interconnected, but because the journal's published by a publisher which keeps the articles behind a paywall in order to generate revenue, the blog space is open and available and interactive and includes the community, but the journal space is quite closed. Whereas in 19 we don't have those kinds of constraints, and so we could bring in, or we could exploit blogging technologies, the kind of interactivity, comments. We could publish shorter articles. We could reach out to broader audiences, both broader scholarly audiences, but also more broadly into the wider world beyond. The Dickens Our Mutual Friend reading project, a fantastic unfolding exploration of a novel that we know and are kind of relearning as we read it in separate parts, could be part of the journal rather than be kept at arm's length on a separate blog space. There could be more dialogue, I think, between the scholarly article as we've understood it and those other ways of interacting with audiences beyond.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I thought that the Our Mutual Friend project did have its birth from actually this anniversary issue. But there is, there does seem to be quite a separation. There's no reference to it, for example, on the latest issue of 19. I was surprised to see, at least that I saw. And, as you say, the kind of parallel universe that JVC has to do is because JVC is a journal that it's charged for, whereas the blog is free. But we now have the possibility with 19, it seems to me, of integrating a blog and thinking about how to activate readers who might be willing to put short comments, on articles that were constructive and helpful and interesting.
There are editorial challenges with all of this, aren't there? You can't just, you have to build a community, and you have to write it, you have to get an audience, a group willing to write interesting blog posts in the first place, and you have to kind of monitor and moderate and do all those kinds of things. I think we're in a mature digital culture now in which it's possible, which I think is important because it means we can push against some of the genres of scholarly publishing. And I think we have the kind of latitude and the opportunity to try and do slightly different things. I think short form scholarly writing is something we could make much more use of, which is something that's really been pioneered in blog spaces, where people have been writing shorter versions of scholarly works on blogs. They're freely available with an eye on people reading on short journeys, on mobile devices, and as a way of making scholarship seem a bit more urgent, about cutting out the delays between having an idea, presenting it at a conference, writing it up, publishing it in an article.
Yes.
A way of making scholarship seem a bit more immediate. And given the way in which the humanities is often characterised in broader culture and broader political circles, any opportunity we have to show that scholars are thinking about urgent affairs which matter, I think we should seize those opportunities.
I agree. I mean, one of the things about the kind of article length in 19 is that it's fairly similar, isn't it? And it's long, long pieces. And I remember we did talk about article length at the beginning, but a variation in it. And as you said, space for notes, of interest. Not necessarily only in the blog space, but I think that would be very, it would pep up the journal. Well, I think.
And 19, as we said, comes out of a culture, a community of scholars based around Birkbeck and based around London. And the more we can make the journal reflect that community and the vibrancy of that community, the better, I think. There's a place, of course, for the scholarly articles understood, and we have to make sure that reigns central to what the journal does, not least because it answers a lot of questions people have about the authority of digital publishing and scholarship.
And the peer review thing is really important.
But if one of the things we value about 19 is its connection to the place, and we value the fact that its issues are related to events, then let's make more of that community. Let's more of the place, and let's reflect some of the vibrancy that goes on. Because I think a collection of themed articles is one way to do that. but it's a kind of way of memorialising an event, writing it up into a kind of a reach for permanence. Whereas I think there's lots more transitory ways of writing, of capturing a moment, which have their own value and their own place in digital culture.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting that, of course, online, you know, the 19th Century Study Centre is very alive and very much, you know, in dialogue with its readers and so on. And none of that is, you know, is reflected, I mean, as you say, in these twice-a-year journal issues. And, you know, it's another interesting thing about pre-publication. I don't know what, you know, 19 would want to do with that. But that is another possibility. Because if, you know, it seems to me like historic journals often published in different time frames, right? We could do that, right? We could do that.
I think that's a good point, that you can have an unfolding series of things that go up as and when they're ready, and still have the themed content coming out periodically as and when it's ready.
Which is a different thing. Which is a different thing,
But
right?
it would
Then
be,
you'd read for the theme, for the whole shape thief of
but
the
it
thing.
would be like publishing, say, a daily edition of something, and then a weekly budget edition as well, which comes out. And by budget, I'm thinking of the Pall Mall budget.
Yeah, the Pall Mall
where you
budget.
kind of have a kind of a bigger publication for a different kind of reader at a moment, for a different sort of moment.
But so many 19th century journals did that. Household Goods did it, right? They published weekly and they published monthly.
Yeah.
And it was just routine. Many, particularly weekly publications. But absolutely. You know, so I mean, and you know, 6 monthly is a very sedate, shall we say. It's very sedate. It's almost sedate as quarterly, you know. Well, it's more sedate than quarterly even, you know. And so one way of keeping 19 vibrant and, you know, in people's face would be to release, you know, material as and when it was ready.
Well, 19 is so well established now. It's been going a decade, which is a long time, right?
For a digital.
And it's a well-established journal. It's scholarship, and the articles it's published speak for themselves. I think that bit of 19 is established and done. It's got its place in 19th century scholarship. It's got its place in the world of the history of digital scholarship as well, in a way. And now I think it's like the next phase of 19. What might be done with it now? How might it take further advantage of its digital medium? How might it push back against the forms that it's inherited? And how might it engage new readers? Right? Like I said, new scholarly readers, but also all those other people who can call up 19 with just a tap of the keyboard. Because I think it needs to serve more than the people.
Well, we talked, didn't we, about Facebook, a Facebook site for 19, and a Twitter feed. You thought that was really quite important.
Well, I think in terms of finding aids and building communities, social media it is important. There's just other channels through which content can be distributed and disseminated, can be talked about, and that buzz that goes around scholarly articles, and we might want to encourage around scholarly articles, might be fostered.
Absolutely. And I mean, you said that you thought that we needed to go out and get our readers. And the Twitter would do that. You know, absolutely it would do that. And I think that was a very, you know, convincing suggestion.
So finance. So there's always a cost, isn't there, with publishing? And there's costs are bound up with both editorial work and also working with the medium itself too. Yes. And in digital publishing, it remains the case. And so for 19, it's been funded, as I understand it, through various sources of money around Birkbeck.
Temporary funding, you might say, yes.
And then the money's funded the interns, and one of the strengths of 19 is the internships and the fact the interns are paid. I think we have to be very conscious about using the free labour of members of the scholarly community. But the challenge in journal and periodical publishing is ongoing funding, and it has been in the 19th century, and it continues to be so today. And I guess for a journal like 19, which hasn't got a formal publisher as such, that's a real, and doesn't charge for access. That's the challenge, and we're being encouraged in British scholarly publishing to think about green and gold open access, an author pays model, green open access, a model kind of sidesteps those kinds of questions entirely by encouraging authors to archive their articles or to publish in venues which don't charge their readers and cover their costs in other ways. And 19 at the moment very much falls within this green open access model. It doesn't charge its authors, it doesn't charge its readers, it finds its
own finance. Yeah.
But do you think the endowed journal, W.T.
Yes,
Stead's dream,
it is an endowed journal, that's right.
Is the way to run scholarly publishing?
Well, I mean, I know, and you probably from the beginning heard, I mean, all the, really terrible scrabbling around we had to do for finance. And we had to do it periodically, And so, very often when we met in the spring, there would be this doer meeting. We'd say, well, the money's run out and, and so on. And then people would go away and try to find sources and we've got another year and so on. Okay, so Jim and I were talking over lunch since you asked us to talk about finance, and we came up with, I came up with, and I don't know to what degree Jim agrees with this, but one of the things I thought about was advertising. And I thought that advertising, even in a free journal, if in fact these adverts were resplendent, right, that they might actually liven up the journal. Now, I don't mean glancing, second long moving images the way we see on the web in web advertising. I mean more sedate, fixed, they would have to be attached to the item articles because otherwise nobody would see them, right? Because the journal is not presented as an ongoing PDF. Yeah. So they would have to be attached articles, but that could be done, it seems to me. And if they, I'm thinking about 19th century journals where display adverts were really interesting and, very kind of wonderful digressions of graphics. And they had all these ornaments in the 19th century press, and they used fonts inventively and so on. So quite interesting Victorian, analogues to what we might do with advertising. So I'm kind of interested in advertising to see whether, a publisher, now, I mean, you brought up this point that, such an advert would last for 6 months and beyond. It would have a longevity. So if it were for books or a journal, it would be there for anybody who then looked at the journal to look at and maybe say, oh yeah, I forgot about that, that book or that, whatever, magazine or whatever. So advertising was one thing we thought about. Now there was something else. What else were we talking about? Do you remember?
Well, for me, the best model is the thing that we really value about 19 is its contribution to scholarship and the opportunity it gives for people to learn about digital literacy and to learn about editorial practices. Then I think institutions have a vested interest in showing off their activities to the best possible light. And I think that it's a case that's difficult to be made in straitened times, that it is worth endowing a journal in this respect. But the sums are quite small in institutional terms, and the benefits are immense to the students who pass through the programme and to scholarship more broadly, but also in terms of marketing, to be vulgar about it, in terms of showing off the institution.
I mean, fundraising and locating donors.
Yeah.
As a university target.
But also about raising the profile of programmes that are taught in a particular institution, raising the profile of the activities that happen. I think scholarly publishing is part of the job of a university in a way, and it also pays dividends in ways that are perhaps more recognisable by university management and administration.
So people might be, as we think, of course we think that people will be attracted to Birkbeck because we produce this journal and because it comes out of our arts, faculty and so on. The other thing,
especially if the reach is developed of the journal, if we can reach a bit beyond the audiences that perhaps it reaches so far out into the city, into the nation, into the world even, and just draws attention to the kinds of scholarly conversations, draws more attention to the kinds of scholarly conversations that happen in an institution like this.
I must say, I think that the notion of an endowment fund that would be dedicated to the journal would be the best option. I see no reason why that is incompatible with advertising.
No.
I think advertising is interesting copy. That's my view. But I also mooted this third alternative, which is much more controversial. And it's this. It's Project Muse. Well, it means, of course, I mean, we know that Victorian Periodical Review went from, for a short time, it went from, really worrying about money because of the few sales of its cover, price, to being in a very healthy financial state as a result of money from Project Muse. But Project Muse, of course, which buys access to distribution, depends on the journal being charged for. Right. And if in the event that there really was no other source of funding, it seems to me that it would be possible for 19 to make some modest charge, which after all VPR's charges were quite modest. They were. And then become eligible for the purchase by JSTOR for the archives and Project Muse for the current issues. I think it's a last resort, but I think that it is a possibility. And of course, the dissemination through Project Muse is quite considerable, isn't it?
It is. I don't see though those kinds of databases of journal. I think they're a way of maintaining a kind of scholarly integrity over the back issue of the archive, in a way of sort of imposing a bibliographical order over scholarship in the past. And they're an important way of raising revenue, sure, but at the cost of denying access to content.
Oh yeah.
And I think holding scholarship to ransom like that should always be the last option.
I agree.
Particularly old scholarship, because it's a way of sort of going back to some of the worst aspects of print again, by saying there's this stuff that's been published and it's fixed, but we're going to keep it in some very privileged spaces that only certain people can have access to. Whereas we've got now a publishing medium, especially with the web, in which we can publish very quickly, very cheaply. And so the costs of doing those aspects of print are no longer there. For me, the costs are in labour, and if we can recognise that labour, 19's a tremendous asset for Birkbeck, a tremendous asset for 19th century scholarship. And so I think we should kind of build on that as an asset. And part of its asset is that it's free. It's available to everybody.
It's certainly true.
So let's do that. Let's make that service to the scholarly community.
I'm just thinking about the financial community and climate that we're in, and the way universities have been pushed and shoved, financially. It is. It may be that we can make this argument, and of course I would regard this as a very last resort. But I do think that it's, it has to be on some sober, set of alternative plans. And, if in three, I mean, it's also hard to know how the institutions will think about themselves in 3 years' time, and how scholarship plays out and so on, and whether the commitment of the community is greater because we can organize some of these ways of bringing 19 to the attention of everyone, and enhancing it through podcasts and different forms of interactivity, and medium. I just think that finance has kept, as it has in all journals, of course, and that's partly why journals are short-lived or have longevity. And of course, private patronage has always been there. Always been there. And if the institution gets, a patronage program, a donor program going, then this seems to me to be a very good, reason for, as Stead said, endowment. I think it's a great journal that has evolved with, technology, with scholarship, with Birkbeck, and so I think it's got a really interesting future. I'm really watching that space.
I agree. I think 19 was a pioneer when it appeared in 2005. appeared shakily
and
bravely into a world that I think we're all trying to understand.
It was born.
It was born.
Yes.
But it quickly found a place, and 10 years, like we said, is a real achievement. A decade's worth of scholarship, decades worth of content, all those interns that have passed through the programme, all those scholars that have written for the journal. And I think it's at the moment now where it's ready to embrace the next stage, the future. And it's ready to kind of carry on in the pioneering spirit in which it was founded, to explore the possibilities of scholarly publishing in the digital age.
I agree. I think when you talk to interns, they remember Birkbeck through 19. It's really something.